Assassin's Creed Shadows. What a journey that game's been, right? It's officially been 1 year since it came out. To be honest, time has flown by so fast that we're now closer to the next Assassin's Creed than we are to when Shadows first came out. So this feels like the perfect time to come back to it and talk about the game 1 year later now that the dust has settled. I want to see if my opinions on the game have stayed the same, or if they've changed after sitting with it for this long. Because let's be real, this was a controversial release, not just in the overall gaming space, but even inside the Assassin's Creed community itself. So with that said, let's start with the first thing I want to talk about. Real quick before we get back to the video, I want to talk about this game that's basically become a permanent fixture on this channel. If you've been following me for a while, you've seen me talk about Raid Shadow Legends, but today is actually a huge milestone. Stick around until the end of this segment because the rewards they're giving out for their 7th anniversary are genuinely the best I've ever seen, and you do not want to miss out. Raid is officially 7 years old, and looking back at my first ever sponsor for them a couple of years ago, it's a bit painful. My setup was a mess, my delivery was awkward, and I clearly had no idea how to gear my champions back then. But just like this channel has evolved, Raid has too. It's gone from a good collection RPG to the absolute benchmark of the genre. I personally use these sponsorships to level up my gear and keep this channel going full time. So a massive thank you to Raid for supporting the community for so long. What keeps me hooked after all this time is how deep the strategy actually goes. Yes, you can collect the coolest looking characters, but it's also about the constant updates and new factions like the Knights. Whether I'm chilling with some dungeon runs or actually testing my roster in the live arena, there's always a new goal to hit. I still get that same rush pulling shots today as I did on day 1. If you haven't jumped in yet, this is the literal best time in the game's history to start. If you use my link in the description or scan the QR code on screen right now, you get an exclusive $200 anniversary package you can't get anywhere else. You'll instantly unlock the legendary champion Krokmar the Devourer. Then as you level up, the rewards keep coming. 500,000 silver at level 15, 500 energy at level 20, the epic champion Galapo the Recluse at level 25, a 5-star chicken at level 30 to max out your legendaries, and 7 million silver at level 35. On top of that, new players can use promo code RAID7 to get Pelops the Victor, an insane legendary HP tank. Or if you have a specific playstyle in mind, you can choose one of these 6 legendaries on screen. Personally, I still stand by Ultimate Death Knight, especially for the easiest early game, but Sun Wukong is also a top tier pick. And on top of that, Raid is also celebrating the anniversary with rewards for everyone already playing the game too. There's a 7-day gift chain running right now, which means every single day you log in, you'll get a new reward waiting for you. They're also running a Titan event, where you can earn a special 7th anniversary avatar frame. Just remember, you have to use my link or QR code first to qualify. Once you're in, come find me under the name The Hidden One, and join the Hidden One's clan. Let's celebrate 7 years of Raid together. It's impossible to make this video without talking about the rocky launch of the game. In fact, saying rocky launch is a bit of an understatement. Before the game even had a confirmed and set in stone release date, the sentiment around Shadows from the online space was negative. And at the same time, Ubisoft themselves were in a really weird spot. I mean, they still are. They needed Shadows to be a massive success. Think about what they put out in the years leading up to this game. Skull and Bones finally limped out of development hell, and we know how that went. Avatar Frontiers of Pandora was not a huge success. Star Wars Outlaws didn't set the world on fire like they expected. Their stock was simply dipping lower and lower, so Shadows was supposed to be the saving grace. But then the red flags started popping up. Remember when they pulled out the Tokyo Game Show at the last second? Shortly after, they delayed the game from its original November slot to February. They even refunded all existing pre-orders and scrapped the early access model that they'd been pushing for years. That told us everything we needed to know. They were fundamentally rethinking how they were launching the game, because they knew that if they put out a half-baked product in that already negative environment, the franchise might never recover. And while all of that was happening, there was another massive conversation dominating the gaming space, the Yasuke controversy. This became the loudest conversation in gaming for months. Now, I'll be honest, I can understand some of the backlash in a certain way. Assassin's Creed was finally going to Japan after people had been asking for it for a long time. This was the setting most people wanted more than anything, and in a lot of people's minds, the expectation was pretty simple: a male Japanese assassin as the main character. And realistically, Ubisoft could have done exactly that, fully focused on traditional Assassin's Creed characters, and the conversation would have easily been more positive. But instead they chose Yasuke. And here's where the debate really exploded, because Yasuke in the context of Assassin's Creed just doesn't naturally fit as a protagonist. He's a samurai, a big and flashy one at that. Parkour isn't really his thing, stealth isn't really his thing either. So it created this strange situation where the character who actually plays like an assassin who is Naue sometimes felt pushed to the side for a lot of the moments. The whole assassin vs Templar conflict, which is supposed to be the backbone of the franchise, was treated as side content. And weirdly, it ended up being Yasuke hunting the Templars down instead of the actual assassin character. Now of course there was another controversy around Yasuke, and this was the, let's just say, louder one. And it got genuinely disgusting. It turned into a full-scale culture war fueled by some of the most blatant racism I've seen in gaming. The lengths people went to discredit Yasuke as a real human being that did exist was insane. I remember at one point I saw a tweet blowing up where somebody was LARPing as a Japanese historian, writing these long, scholarly sounding threads about Yasuke. Fast forward a few months, and that person was exposed as a white American man using Google Translate to pretend that they were Japanese to give their bias some unearned authority. Then you had bigger accounts leading into it. We were seeing large creators make George Floyd memes and thumbnailing Yasuke in ways that were clearly meant to dog whistle the worst parts of the internet. And those pulled hundreds of thousands, if not millions of views. It felt like every week there was a new conspiracy. It even got to a point where people were claiming the Japanese government was stepping in to ban the game. However, if you looked into it for more than 5 seconds, the Japanese government does not give a shit because it's just a fictional video game. But you see, on the internet, Yasuke was framed as an international incident. Genuine conversations on if Assassin's Creed Shadows was going to be a good game or a bad game were impossible, because you were constantly dodging this wave of pure toxicity and racism. And Yasuke was just one piece of that controversy. You also had people pointing out things that were inaccurate. The main outrage online was around architectural inaccuracies. For example, the usage of square tatami mats, cherry blossoms, or even autumn leaves. Now look, I get it in a way. Accuracy does matter within Assassin's Creed, especially when one of the big appeals of the franchise is historical tourism. But this whole controversy showed me something else. There are a lot, and I mean a lot, of fake gamers out there who clearly had not played Assassin's Creed before talking with so much confidence. Because if you actually look at the franchise's history, historical inaccuracies have always been there. I mean, take Black Flag for example. This is just one game. Black Flag places a massive cathedral right there in Havana's main plaza, even though that cathedral did not start construction until almost 1 century later. In Valhalla, which by the way is probably one of, if not the most historically inaccurate Assassin's Creed game, the Vikings are running around in leather and using two-handed swords that did not exist for another 200 years. But again, was anybody outraged? No, this franchise has always played loose with history for the sake of cool. But I noticed it was only with Japan the internet became a board of historical scholars. Western culture has an interesting obsession with Japan. It's often seen in the West as a land of pure perfection. You don't see this with any other setting. Nobody was outraged because a Saxon building in Valhalla was made of stone instead of timber. But a square mat in the Sengoku period? Oh no, that's too far. And because of all this manufactured nitpicking, it created a disrespectful narrative around the game to the casual audience who knew nothing about Assassin's Creed. I mean, it got so bad that Ubisoft actually had to put out a formal statement saying, "Hey, we're making a work of fiction, please stop harassing our staff." When you have to do that before the game is even out, you know you're in for a rough ride. Of course, fast forward 1 year later, the game wasn't a complete disaster financially, but it also wasn't a massive success. It just came and went. I'll touch more on that when I discuss the post-launch. Moving on from the drama, let's actually talk about the open world itself, because for over a decade, Japan was the holy grail for the franchise. It was the one setting almost everybody was asking for. So did it actually deliver on that decade of hype? Visually, absolutely. This is easily one of the most beautiful maps that Ubisoft has ever built. They tend to be pretty good at that, creating visually good looking games. The regions I thought felt genuinely distinct, and I have to give major credit for the season system. That was a stroke of genius that felt like a truly unique addition to the Assassin's Creed identity. Watching the world transition from, spring to autumn to winter and so on was refreshing for a franchise that's always had a static world system. Personally, the snow regions were my absolute favorite. There's just something about the atmosphere of a snow-covered Japanese landscape that feels nice to explore. But here's the problem. While the world is stunning, it feels like it's lacking a soul. And this goes for a lot of Ubisoft games in general. The map is a bit of a facade. On the surface, it's this big open world, but in practice, it felt surprisingly restrictive. I absolutely despise the constant trees and foliage being in your face. And don't even get me started on the constant hill sliding. It felt like the developers were always nudging you or forcing you to stay on the designated paths. For an open world game, I felt trapped by the geography more often than I felt free to explore it. And while the massive Japanese castles were a positive for me, they did start to suffer a lack of variety. You would approach these castles, but the puzzle of how to tackle them felt the same every single time. Kill X amount of samurai daisho and open the chest. There was not enough variety to make the 5th castle feel as special as the first. They clearly tried to move away from the checklist style of Odyssey or Valhalla, where the map is just a sea of icons, but in doing so, they created a world that feels empty. I also have to mention the target board. Ubisoft tried to make it feel like this massive investigative web of targets, but in reality almost all of them were filler. You're just hunting down nameless icons for the sake of checking a box. However, there was only one, and I mean one exception, and that was Nobusuna's students. This target board questline actually felt like it had a heart. It's a series of 7 intense, unique fights where Yasuke has to prove his sensei's sword school isn't broken. Each fight had a great mini story, and I thought the flashbacks with Yasuke and his sensei were actually well thought out. I mean, even the rewards for this questline actually felt unique. It was a glimpse of what the game could have been if every single side quest had that level of care. But unfortunately, that's where the quality ends. Aside from those duels, there's a massive lack of meaningful side content. Most of what you find is just kill X amount of bandits, or collect X amount of things. The side content we did get felt incredibly lazy and repetitive. You got those kata, the kujikiri, the shrines, the parkour trails, and the Kofu tombs. I'm sure there were a few more. The first few of these activities were super fun to do, until you realize that that's all there is. You can tell the effort dropped off a cliff halfway through development. Those first kujikiri encounters are actually tied to story missions and they feel like they matter. But after that, it's just the same animation and same gameplay loop over and over again. It's filler in its purest form. Compared to something like Origins, which felt like a living, breathing ecosystem, Shadows feels like a very pretty, very expensive museum exhibit. You can look, and it's gorgeous to look at, but there's no heart beating underneath it. Now let's get into the actual core of the game, which is a gameplay split. This was one of the most marketed features of Shadows, and to be honest, it's the part of the game I actually liked the most. Ubisoft went with a dual protagonist system where you can swap between Naoe and Yasuke pretty much on the fly, and I do think that was a smart move. It forces you to look at the world through 2 completely different lenses, and it's not just a light difference like in Syndicate, where Jacob and Evie are practically the same. In Shadows, it drastically affects gameplay. If you're playing as Naoe, a giant gate is a parkour puzzle. If you're playing as Yasuke, that same gate is just something you're going to smash through. That variety is great because it keeps the overall gameplay from feeling stale. But if I'm being totally honest, I played as Naoe about 90% of the time. When I pick up an Assassin's Creed game, I want to be an assassin. I want functional parkour and the feeling of clearing an area without anybody knowing I was there. Naoe does deliver on that classic assassin fantasy type of character. I'll get into parkour and stealth more in depth soon. But to put it short, her movement is very fast. She has the grapple hook, which adds a much needed vertical layer to exploration, and thankfully it's not like Syndicate's grapple hook, which I thought was terrible. Her stealth capabilities are a step forward in my opinion, such as prone crawling and extinguishing lights. I do believe my top 3 stealth Assassin's Creed games are Mirage, Shadows and Unity, so it's a good thing that Shadows has great stealth. But going back to Naoe's movement, and even though she is fast and flashy on paper, we have to talk about the technical side of it, because this to me feels like it's where the game simply launched and finished. It's crazy to me that we're even talking about parkour updates for an Assassin's Creed game 1 year later. That's the bread and butter of the series. It's the one thing that should be 100% polished and functioning on day 1. Instead, Ubisoft spent months patching in features that should have been there from the jump. I'm talking about basics like manual jumping, functional side ejects, and functional back ejects. These are core mechanics we've all been begging for since the pre-RPG era, and having them added in updates almost 1 year later shows you just how rushed the development was. They were literally building the foundation of the movement system while people were already playing the game. The irony is that even with these fixes, there's a massive disconnect because the environment just isn't suited for it. You're stuck in these massive stretches of open fields, forests, and those annoying hills where you're sliding down 24/7. There's no flow at all. It feels like a waste that they put all this effort into Naoe's animations and patching in legacy features, but then they dropped her into a world better suited for a horse than an assassin. It's a total facade. The mechanics are basically shouting that they are assassin-like, but the map design of Shadows is always going to be an open world RPG. I just hope that they're taking notes for the future, and what they've done with the parkour updates is a blueprint for Hexe. If Assassin's Creed Hexe is actually actually going to be the unique game for the franchise, they need to launch it with functioning parkour and a world actually built to be climbed from the start. Because right now, Shadows feels like a beta test for movement systems that were never given a proper playground to shine in. And then you have Yasuke. Now look, his combat is his one and only appeal. There's a definite power fantasy in being this absolute tank of a samurai who just deletes enemies. If you're into the warrior style of the more recent RPG games like Valhalla, you'll probably love Yasuke's gameplay. But for me, he felt like he belonged in a different game. Because he's a samurai, his stealth is basically non-existent. You can do stealth with him, just not very efficiently. He can't climb most of the architecture that Naoe can, which makes parkouring with him feel kind of sluggish. It creates this weird imbalance where one character feels like the complete package for an Assassin's Creed game, and the other character feels like a specialized tool where you only pull out when you're forced to fight a boss, or let's say a massive wave of enemies. There's also the issue of resource distribution. Because they have different gear and different skill trees, you're constantly managing two separate characters in one game. It was always a bit of a letdown to find a legendary piece of armor while playing as Naoe, knowing it was useless to the character I actually wanted to be playing. It felt like my focus was being split 50-50, even though my interest was 90-10. And while the shared progression is a nice touch, meaning you don't have to grind levels for both characters at the same time, the story often forces you into one or the other for specific story moments. There were genuinely moments where I was enjoying a stealth heavy mission only to be shoved into a forced combat encounter as Yasuke, and it just killed my momentum. So yes, ultimately the split is a cool experiment that mostly works, but it does highlight a fundamental identity crisis in modern Assassin's Creed. It's like Ubisoft is still scared to go full stealth, so they included Yasuke as a safety net for the people who just want to hack and slash. I understand the concept that they were going for in that it's a choose your own adventure type of game, that's fun, but it makes the game feel a little bit cohesive than if they're just committed to one vision and one vision only. Moving on to the story, I have to start this section with a massive confession, and to be honest, it might be my biggest mistake on YouTube ever. In my review for Shadows, I said I enjoyed the story. Now, I'm holding my hands up here. I was dishonest and I regret it. I had just finished the story and rushed to make the review, so I didn't give the game time to actually digest in my brain. Now, 1 year later, my opinion has completely flipped. And that's fine, opinions can change. The reality is that this story has almost nothing to do with Assassin's Creed. We're 14 games into the franchise, and yet the Assassin vs Templar conflict was non-existent. Instead, we got Samurai vs Templars. Naoe, the actual assassin, spends her time focusing on the Shinbaku, a group of villains so forgettable I can't even remember their names. The only interesting character in that group was Oda Nobunaga, and even he could not carry the weight of this disjointed mess. It's obvious they tried to go for a more grounded approach, but in doing so, they made a story for nobody. There's no first civilization lore at all, there's no Pieces of Eden at all, there's no modern day story at all. This is the furthest the franchise has ever drifted from its own DNA. It feels like they were embarrassed to be an Assassin's Creed game. I made a video about that problem, so check it out if you haven't. I go way more in depth. But essentially, it feels like Ubisoft Quebec do not want to make Assassin's Creed games. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. I'll give credit where it's due. Yasuke's storyline was actually very good. His personal journey of hunting down the Templars kept me engaged from start to finish, and it was simply written better than Naoe. But because the game uses that non-linear choose your target system, the narrative feels scattered. It's not a cohesive journey, it's a checklist of kills, and because you can do them in any order, the personalities of the protagonists do not evolve at all. It is forced to stay the same. The presentation also took a massive hit. Most of the story is told through these static, procedurally generated cutscenes that looked like they were made by an indie company on a budget. When motion capture did finally show up, it felt like a rare reward. It makes the weak dialogue and awkward, uncharismatic voice acting stand out even more. And to be honest, after hearing from Naoe's voice actor, it all makes sense. She basically admitted that Ubisoft were flying blind. In a normal production, you'd get the full script of the story and you'd build a character. But for Shadows, Naoe's voice actor said she didn't know what was happening next. She would finish a scene, go home for weeks or months and wait for the writers to figure out writing the next part of the story. She was literally getting the script piece by piece, sometimes only a few days before shooting. According to her, the writers were constantly fighting with time and second guessing the direction of the story while the game was literally being made. Now that to me explains so much. How are the actors supposed to give a cohesive, evolving performance when the writers themselves don't even know where the story is going yet? It's simply amateur hour. There were so many scenes in Shadows that just felt so corny or lacked any emotional depth, making it impossible to care about that character. And don't even get me started on the ending of the story. It's abrupt and simply incomplete, and it does conclude in a very poorly written DLC. If anything, it felt like Ubisoft chopped the final act off on purpose just to sell it back to us as DLC later. And for a AAA studio with Ubisoft's resources and budgets, they need to do better. You can't just give us a visually beautiful looking game and then fill it with a story that feels like an afterthought. Wrapping things up, we have to talk about the post-launch and what this game's legacy actually is 1 year later. Now, putting it bluntly, my stance is simple. I would only recommend people to play Assassin's Creed Shadows once Ubisoft completely stops supporting the game with updates. Why? Because only then will we finally have a feature-complete game. Since that first post-launch update, it's been a constant drip feed of meaningless updates mixed with features that should have been there on day one. I'm talking about basic UI fixes, parkour mechanics like manual jumping, and quote-unquote new features that were a staple in the past. It's transparent and I hate it. It shows Ubisoft's original intention was to launch Assassin's Creed Shadows as a live service single-player game. They wanted to keep you playing a single-player game as if it's a multiplayer game by adding minor updates instead of giving us a finished product at launch. Yes, it's great that the developers are listening to people to fix the parkour, but my question is, why now? Nobody plays a single player game for a full year straight just to wait for a patch that makes parkour functional. Look at Ghost of Yote, look at Expedition 33. Those are feature complete games, with the only exception being adding expansions or DLCs. And don't even get me started on the microtransactions. If you watch my videos, you know my stance on this. I will never support $25 Helix packs in a game that already costs $70. It's a predatory design, plain and simple. It's also a single player game. Their post-launch editions have been a total rollercoaster that mostly just crash and burn their reputation. To be fair, they did add some good content. The Critical Role collab was nice and the Oni mission had some cool moments. But then they followed it up with the Attack on Titan collab, which is still being memed into oblivion because of how low effort it looked. Then there's the Cassandra statue, which literally breaks her own established lore. I actually made dedicated videos on both of these topics if you want the full rant. But the short version is, it felt desperate. I'm just glad Ubisoft are finally slowing down. Assassin's Creed Shadows is moving into its final phase of support now that we've hit the anniversary, and that's for the best. The interest of the game is at an all-time low. It's time to save those resources and move on. Let's be real, if this game was the massive record-breaking success Ubisoft wants us to believe by saying terms like high player engagement in their financial reports, they wouldn't have cancelled the second expansion and also the co-op mode. You don't pull the plug on an apparently successful game. It's okay to admit it wasn't a massive success. Just learn the lessons and move on. Once again, thank you to Raid for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to use the link in the description or scan my QR code on screen to get those insane anniversary bonuses for new players, including epic champions and legendaries.